Greetings from Penang, Malaysia. My name is PAWL Trebus. I recently had an opportunity to be the concluding speaker at the final live Ex-Mormon Foundation Conference in Salt Lake City. I'd like to thank Richard Packham, Kathleen Jones, and Sue Emmett for giving me the opportunity to share the microphone with Will Bagley, Simon Southerton, and Kathleen Kimball-Melanakis. Now, despite tremendous technical efforts on the part of Steve Corey, my presentation was sadly cut short. I'm honored by the overwhelming response that I've received to what was presented, and in the following video, I'm pleased to share with you that full presentation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed preparing it for you. About 600 years before the birth of Christ, a Greek slave was credited as the author of many tales. In one of these Aesop's fables, the wind and the sun were arguing over who was greater. They saw a traveler coming down the road, and the sun said, "I see a way to decide our dispute. Whichever of us can cause that traveler to take off his cloak shall be regarded as the stronger. You begin." The sun hid behind a cloud, and the wind began to blow as hard as he could. The harder he blew, the more the traveler wrapped his cloak around him. Finally, the wind gave up. The sun popped out and shone his glory down, and the traveler soon found it too hot to continue with his cloak on, and so he took it off. The purported moral of this fable is that kindness impacts us more than severity, and that gentleness and kind persuasion win where force and bluster fail. The point of the story can be understood without belief the events described actually happened. The real world does not contain animated suns, talking frogs, and conceited city mice. It is also quite possible that this particular slave did not even tell this particular story. Part of the enjoyment of these volumes is the implicit understanding that they can contain universal truths, even if they or the tales of their history and authorship are not literally true. No one has a strong vested interest in these stories. Religious convictions are not connected to them. Families do not fight over them. Aesop's fables are simply seen as quaint tales that may do somebody, somewhere, some good. Long before I became a technology innovator, I turned 11 and became a Mormon. The missionaries who lived in our house made sure I was fed the then standard narrative. These two earnest young men, one tall, the other taller, taught me the lessons well. I was permitted to make the adult decision to become a Mormon. Shortly after, I walked into the apartment behind our house and found the elder who baptized me laying on a bed with a girl in my ward several months before her 13th birthday. As I stood there shocked, I was brutally ushered out by his companion, who held me upside down, twisting my leg until I cried. He threatened more physical violence if I told anyone what I'd seen. Eventually, this illicit relationship came to the attention of my mother, and from her to the mission president, who took control. He swore all the families involved to secrecy. The elders were not released and sent home. The members of the congregation were not told. The police were not called. The companionship was split up and each was transferred. The whole thing was swept under the rug. What was plain to me then and now was that a truth that could negatively impact the faith of others was something that should not be talked about openly. A few years later, I came to seminary surprised to find people crying and happy. I asked why. Between joyous sobs, they shared that Spencer W. Kimball, our prophet, had just received a new revelation allowing all worthy male members to be ordained. I was puzzled until one of them said that blacks could now hold the priesthood. I was shocked. Our family moved a lot, and we had been among the few white kids in the public schools in Oakland, California. We knew firsthand the stings of racism and ostracism. One of my guiding lights was a burning conviction to specifically not be racist. I was surprised to learn for the first time that anyone had ever not been able to hold the priesthood because of their skin color. My worried bishop quickly reassured me there were good reasons for the ban, and gave me a copy of a book called Mormonism and the Negro. He testified of the claims of the book and that the ban was doctrinal, required, and from God. By then much of my identity came from being a Mormon. The church offered community, family, and stability. It seemed a moot point going forward. According to my bishop, we Mormons weren't racist, and never had been. When it came time to serve my mission, I passed. I still had no respect for the missionaries. Instead, I graduated early from high school, married the bishop's daughter, and started my own technology company. We fell into the routine of being chapel Mormons and set about making and raising good Mormon children of our own. As a technology innovator, I wrote and worked with hundreds of thousands of lines of source code. I developed and patented things no one had ever seen before. A large part of my time was spent debugging, finding little things here and there that weren't quite right that could impact the big picture. Years later, despite making polygamy jokes while being the MC for Pioneer Day, I found myself serving in a leadership role in the church as a member of a stake presidency in California. Soon after, Proposition 8 was introduced. The goal? Make same-sex marriage unconstitutional. I wasn't fully on board with church leaders who warned us Satan wanted to destroy traditional families using gay marriage, but I remained silent and supported my leaders. One morning I was out canvassing my neighborhood for support. A door opened. I could see children playing inside, the sun shining down on them. The pleasant woman who answered smiled patiently. I asked if I could place a sign in her yard. She told me she didn't support Prop 8. and that her wife didn't either. The irony hit me in the face. I had become the persecutor, the bully seeking to ostracize her. I felt I was no better than the angry mobs who had once attacked Mormons. I was overcome with a strong feeling that out of all religions, ours should not be the one to call non-traditional marriage counterfeit. I found a dumpster nearby and threw away my remaining signs. When the law passed, my oldest son called me upset. He was no longer an active member and had gone against church teachings by marrying a wonderful woman from a different race. He demanded I justify and explain myself. I tried but couldn't defend the church's position because it was no longer mine. As a church, we had not been honest with our fellow citizens. Our leaders publicly claimed we'd not been involved in Prop 8. I had personally participated in many meetings where we were. It wasn't a closely guarded secret that the amount of money donated would be considered when extending future leadership callings. When these amounts were revealed publicly, everyone knew I'd given nothing. I was released and replaced with someone who had. Shortly after, I moved to Southern California and avoided leadership callings. I tried to go back to being just a chapel Mormon. In October 2013, Dieter Uchtdorf made a startling announcement during conference. Buried in his Doubt Your Doubts talk was an admission past leaders had made mistakes that could cause doubts about our religion and its truth claims. I couldn't recall a leader ever speaking like this. I wondered, will we ever know which leaders, which mistakes? 2 months later, the church released an essay called Race in the Priesthood. As I read it, I felt betrayed. In the essay, the church claims the priesthood ban was just the product of racist men in racist times doing racist things. It specifically disavowed and condemned all racism, past and present, in any form, mentioning directly the teachings from the book my bishop had given me. The church was condemning and disavowing not only prior prophets, doctrine, scripture, and teachings, they were condemning and disavowing me for being racist, the one thing I had been assured we never were. As I was reeling from the implications of this essay, additional essays were quietly published. Each one felt like a blow to my very core, containing startling revelations about troubling aspects of church history and doctrine I'd never been told about. After the 14th essay, I decided my faith needed a serious reboot. If the church itself was now rejecting key portions of things they'd once taught as fundamentally eternal and unchanging, I felt it important that no religious belief of mine be placed beyond scrutiny and examination. I had a lot of questions, and I wondered if others did too. Online, I found others like me. Jeremy Runnels, a faithful returned missionary, was ready to resign over his questions. His grandfather begged him to write them down, promising a family friend, a CES director, would respond. The result was Jeremy's infamous CES letter. Instead of official answers, unofficial apologists attacked and demonized Jeremy. They actually tried to debunk his questions. To me, silencing someone for asking questions seemed more like North Korea than Jesus Christ. Jeremy resigned his church membership minutes before an improperly officiated kangaroo court could kick him out. Part of my spiritual reboot involved studying the world's religions. There were 3 core traits of humanity in every civilization and every time. The first was to have doubts and questions. The second was to have spiritual experiences. And the third was to look for patterns that reconcile the two. To tell people that they shouldn't have doubts or that they should doubt them, well, that's to rob from them a core trait of humanity. More importantly, Jeremy's questions were pretty good. They begged for an explanation. When word got out that the church would now withhold temple priesthood and membership blessings from gay people and from their children, leaders assured us we really weren't homophobic. The arguments and apologetics all seemed very familiar. I prayed about what specifically I was required to believe. What was the bare minimum I had to accept as literally true? I didn't want another 30 years to go by, only to find out these policies were just homophobic leaders in homophobic times making homophobic and unchristlike mistakes that would eventually be disavowed and condemned. As I was struggling to understand what I was required to believe, I found a talk Jeffrey Holland gave in 2006. He claimed members didn't have to have a burning conviction as to the origins of Mormonism, nor be committed to any foundational statement or premise of Mormonism. Well, if I didn't take some things literally, or anything literally, I wasn't going to be kicked out. This resulted in one of those light bulb moments that we all have. Elder Holland was admitting that something didn't have to be literally true to contain truths. As I sat in the pews one Sunday, I looked around and realized I had become a figurative Mormon. I didn't literally believe many of the claims. And then I discovered other figurative Mormons. They were everywhere. They're your teachers, your presidents, your leaders, your missionaries, moms, sons, friends, and family. As I realized they were everywhere, I thought, well, maybe they've always been here. Maybe among the founding Mormons there were figurative Mormons. But then I remember that lesson I'd learned well all those years ago. A truth that could negatively impact the faith of others was something that should not be talked about openly. But Jeremy had placed right at the top of his CS letter a quote from J. Reuben Clark that if we have the truth, it can't be harmed by investigation, and if we have not the truth, it ought to be harmed. He didn't say true. He said truth. Maybe many of the things we've been told were literally true didn't need to be. They could still have a truth inside. Then I came across the Holland Challenge. Elder Holland stated in 2009 that the only way to avoid crawling over, under, or around the Book of Mormon was to make an honest attempt to account for its origin. It was a more refined way of asking how an illiterate farm boy could create 531 pages of heretofore unknown text teeming with literary and Semitic complexity. Well, Jeremy had certainly done a great job of asking questions, but he'd never been given any answers. Now, many people, including me, had had spiritual experiences, but the only explanation offered was the official supernatural narrative. In this challenge, Elder Holland's words spoke to me. I didn't have to go over, under, or around. I could go right through. I just had to make an honest attempt to explain it. I could take all the competing truth claims from believers and former believers and treat them like source code. I could complete my spiritual reboot by debugging the Book of Mormon and Mormonism itself. And so... Challenge accepted. So I traveled here to a luxury beachfront condo in Penang, Malaysia. And with the sounds of the daily Muslim prayers in the background, I accessed high-speed internet and researched thousands and thousands of books, from ancient books to modern books to old books to new books. And what I did was put together not something that I can tell you is definitely how it happened. That'd be foolish to make that claim. All I'm saying is that this is a probable explanation. This is how it could have happened. And if you don't believe my stories are true, that's okay. After all, as a figurative Mormon, I believe that you can find truth in things that are not literally true. I started where most historians, from Bushman to Brodie, began. Lucy Mack Smith. She was more than just a nourishing mother. She was the only author that was present from the bright first chapters of early Mormonism to the dark closing pages in Nauvoo. Within days of crying out to God over the corpses of her martyred children, she engaged young Martha Corey to act as her scribe. They sat for hours as Lucy stared down into the stone-cold past. Less than 1 year after they began, 70-year-old Lucy, despite her lack of a formal education, obtained a copyright for her 300 pages of heretofore unknown text, teeming with literary and Semitic complexity. Yet, she never published it. Despite claiming it was for the benefit of all saints, her book was of critical importance to the few men carefully circling each other for control over the headless church. Mother Smith's memoir could make or break a future prophet, priest, or king. Where other historians quickly accepted her narrative and moved past, I stopped and dug deeper. I found serious issues that had been overlooked by everyone. The first was a ridiculous story of her husband losing money selling crystallized ginseng to China. Well, the timing for the deal was off by months, not allowing for the travel time by ships of the day. Plus the alleged payment in a chest of gold, that was not something the Chinese did. And the Chinese valued the chi of a whole root in the shape of a human body. Why bring up a story where her husband dug up human-shaped roots and chopped them up? Well, then I discovered that her long death scenes had relatives dying from the symptoms of poisoning, drinking rice water, the source of arsenic, through clenched teeth. And there were these long-winded death monologues that included words from old religious texts, one relative quoting St. John of the Cross and another being likened to the Puritan protester Anne Hutchinson, who was killed by Indians. Then Mother Lucy made many, many indirect references to specific locations and names, when she clearly remembered enough to explicitly state them. Was she hiding something? And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a book. It was a ransom note. If you understood the full context of Lucy's narrative, why, you could use it to quickly unravel the truth claims of every branch of Mormonism. Lucy's family had paid dearly, in blood, for the new religion. If she didn't receive some benefit, she'd ruin everything for everyone. Brigham Young knew exactly what had to happen. Lucy and Emma got the money and resources in Nauvoo they needed to survive in return for their silence. Everyone, including Brigham, got to keep their branch of Mormonism. But the world did not get the truth. Shortly after the deal was struck, the prophet James Strang took the saints that followed him north to become the pirate king of Beaver Island, where he performed many Joseph-like miracles. Sidney Rigdon took the few saints that followed him back east. Brigham Young, the Lion of the Lord, modern-day Moses, he took his saints to Salt Lake City, among them Martha Corey. He ordered what he thought was the only copy of Lucy's manuscript thrown into the memory hole of his archives, where he assumed it would be forgotten forever. Lucy and Emma and their family remained in Nauvoo. In 1852, the church finally decided it was time to be more open and honest. Salt Lake leaders announced they had lied for years. Polygamy, long denied and cast as a scandalous lie by unscrupulous anti-annex Mormons, the very issue that had resulted in the deaths of Joseph and Hyrum, was true, doctrinal, and from God. Another bombshell that changed the then standard narrative: Joseph had also been a polygamist. A series of essays by Orson Pratt was rushed into print, explaining things in lawyerly doublespeak. Many felt betrayed. Converts and entire congregations resigned. Missionary efforts, particularly in England, took a beating. Orson was called upon to again work his magic, like the time he had introduced the first vision narrative years after the church had formed. On his way east, Orson came across another copy of Lucy's book and obtained her permission to use it as he saw fit. In England, he heavily edited the work, removing many of her stories, adding things she hadn't included. He took the focus off her entire family to shine a spotlight only on Joseph, making it seem he had approved of the work. Without Brigham Young's knowledge or permission, Orson published the hybrid book in England and used it to resurrect the flagging missionary efforts. When Brigham found out, he was outraged and denounced the book as a tissue of lies. A public spat between Brigham and Orson resulted in rising sales of the book in Salt Lake. When Lucy died, Emma used her resources to help her son, Joseph Smith III, claim leadership of the scattered remnants of the Midwestern saints. The young prophet believed strongly two core tenets his mother had drilled into him since childhood. The first, his father was a good man. The second, who had never practiced polygamy. Young Joseph announced he was coming after Brigham to reclaim the lost saints in Utah. In response, Brigham pulled a Fahrenheit 451 and demanded Orson's version of Lucy's book be banned and all copies rounded up and destroyed. Why did Brigham Young see Lucy's book as a Pandora's box that he tried to close? His concerns should not have been dismissed. These stories certainly should have never been reprinted in a children's book. As I came to fully understand the context of the threat Brigham saw, I discovered hidden threads and buried treasures in Lucy's writing. As each mystery unraveled, I was reminded of the words Lucy spoke in General Conference in 1845. "Are you willing to receive stolen goods or not? I want to know if you believe in such things." For the rest of my presentation, I have a lot of stories in limited time. I'll go quick, but if you miss anything or want more details, be sure to get my book. It's important to note that this is not the Spalding-Rigdon theory. That theory has so many moving parts and never really explains why Rigdon would need Joseph at all when he'd already written fake scriptures on his own. There are a few names that we do need to know. You can research them yourselves, and when you do, I'm pretty sure you'll have a greater understanding of how I can make the bold claim that the Lucy Code lays out the most plausible natural explanation for the way it went down. What she pointed to destroys the truth claims of every branch of Mormonism. Our first stop is the real ancient America. Like all other ancient Americans, the Aztecs never had horses, elephants, cows, goats, sheep, pigs, barley, wheat, bees, chariots, wheels, scimitars, or steel, but they did have cities, 200,000 strong, larger than most in Europe. They had technology, religion, government, modes of transportation, and their own form of currency. They also had sharp and lethal weapons made from volcanic obsidian glass. When Cortez showed up initially, the Aztecs had superior manpower, and they were every bit the equal of the Spaniards. The Spanish were driven off after they brutally slaughtered members of the royal family. They showed up a year later expecting a fight on their hands, not sure they would prevail. What they found instead was a ghost town. In the end, it was Spanish germs, not Spanish steel, that defeated the Aztecs. In addition to their cities and gold being looted, their religious artifacts, including religious mirrors that had allowed their priests to see the future in the heavens, were taken. The old world feasted on the stolen treasures of the new. 50 years later, Queen Elizabeth ruled England with the greatest scientist and magician in the world at her side. John Dee had used astrology to choose the Queen's coronation date. When a new star appeared in the heavens, people were scared. They thought the world was ending and Jesus was returning. As owner of the largest library on earth, Dee sought answers to this heavenly sign. With the later destruction of the Spanish Armada, Dee told the Queen that all of this was a message from God and that she was to be the next King Arthur with Dee, her Merlin. Dee had consulted a history text called the Scotochronicon, a multi-volume work written in Latin containing an earlier abridged history and the earliest references to Arthurian legends. Dee informed the Queen that this time Camelot would be a British empire spanning the globe. He created special instruments and charts, and the Queen selected Francis Drake to make Dee's prophecies reality. Dee next turned his sights on discovering the science behind God's hierarchy of angels. Everyone knew that the entire world was run by different levels of angels and that hidden mysteries would be revealed if you could talk with them. Dee was confident that his stone Aztec mirror was the key to heavenly communication. Ancient civilizations of the Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Aztecs contained lost knowledge that could help Dee, but all their priests and magicians were long dead. He again consulted the Scotochronicon for advice on how to proceed. There he read the legend of Skoda, an Egyptian princess and a Greek prince who had joined forces, wandered in the desert for a bit, and then built ships and sailed west. Their descendants eventually became the first kings and queens of Ireland and Scotland, who kept their sun-worshipping religion. Magic stones were central to these beliefs. They had even brought the stone of scone with them, the very stone pillow the prophet Jacob had used when he'd received his famous vision. Jacob's ladder was the stairway to and from heaven that allowed God and angels to communicate with men. Dee knew Scottish Druids used magic hagstones as seer stones to find lost treasures and see into heavenly realms. If he couldn't find an actual Aztec or Egyptian magician to help him, maybe he could find the next best thing. Someone descended from Irish or Scottish royalty who carried within their veins the blood and power of the lost Egyptians. Edward Kelly showed up with a forged genealogy claiming he was just the man Dee was looking for. As a convicted thief, Kelly's ears had been cut off, but this didn't stop Dee from giving him a trial run. Dee was delighted to discover that Edward could see into the stone. Ever the scientist, he documented their many sessions. Edward claimed that angels from the city of Enoch were communicating with him. These angels taught them the Enochian alphabet, so Kelly could read the parchment cartoon bubbles that showed up whenever they spoke. They learned the ancient Adamic language and were excited when the signet of Solomon was revealed. It contained magic symbols of a compass, square, horizontal mark, and navel line. These would eventually find their way into Freemasonry and Mormonism. If you've ever wondered about the real origins of your garments, now you know they came from Enochian angels communicating through cartoon bubbles in a stolen Aztec mirror to a convicted thief who used a fabricated genealogy to trick the Queen's magician into believing he was descended from Scottish royalty and, being Egyptian by blood, could work with magic stones. The signet also contained letters at the corners that, when read properly, said pay, lay, ale. Edward Kelly, despite being named by Dee as a prophet and seer, eventually grew bored and wanted to trick European royals into believing he knew how to turn lead into gold. To hasten the end of their work, Kelly revealed the final secret of the Enochian angels. The two men were to have all things in common, including wives. They convinced their spouses to go along with this, but when Dee's much younger wife got pregnant, the partnership ended. Dee returned to England and found his library and reputation destroyed. Kelly died from injuries sustained trying to escape a royal prison he'd been thrown into. John Dee's many deeds were written out of the history books, and other scientists learned well that when looking for ancient mysteries, it was best to keep secret anything you couldn't prove. John Dee's unwritten warning over 250 years before Mormonism was if you ever ran into a man who claimed to be a prophet and seer who could talk to the heavens by looking into a seer stone, well, you better keep a close eye on your wife. Starting in the Middle Ages, stonemason guilds sought to protect their wages by carefully controlling the workforce. Master and apprentice masons could travel to any castle or other project and prove their membership in the guild through a series of 4 special handshakes. Many felt Scottish and Irish masons were particularly skilled because of their claimed Egyptian lineage and that civilization's well-known stone projects, including the pyramids. In 1560, exiles from the murderous reign of the Protestant persecuting Queen Bloody Mary published the first mass-produced and easily readable English Bible. The Geneva Bible, dedicated to newly crowned Queen Elizabeth, was extremely popular with over 150 editions. It was the primary Bible of Protestant reformers and the Bible used by Shakespeare, Milton, Knox, and Bunyan. In 1611, King James shocked the world by producing his own Bible. It showed God ruling over a heaven of 3 degrees of the sun, moon, and stars. The controversial first edition included illustrations showing the union of Adam and Eve being solemnized by one of the secret stonemason handshakes. Parts of the text were starkly different. When Adam and Eve discovered their nakedness in the new Bible, they didn't cover themselves with pants, as in all prior Bibles. They covered themselves with Masonic aprons. Further illustrations showed additional genealogies listed in the Bible being formed by that same Masonic handshake. The different tribes of Israel were charted and connected to royal crests, showing how God favored the kings and queens of England. Even the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, was the product of a Masonic union between Joseph and Mary. Not only was this blasphemous Bible rejected by the people, the monarchy was as well. In his youth, Oliver Cromwell had been a live-and-let-live Christian who followed the Dutch theologian Jacobus Arminius. He became a politician and then a failed farmer and suffered a nervous breakdown. He converted to stringent Puritanism. Ignoring the divine right of kings, he signed the execution order for the regicide of King Charles. He gained a reputation as a brutal theocratic dictator and earned the nickname God's Executioner. When he tried to pass on his title as Lord Protector to his unpopular son, motions were put in place to invite a monarchy back into the kingdom. Shortly after this, 2 events radically changed the world. London suffered the last major epidemic of the bubonic plague, killing over 100,000 people. The following year saw the Great Fire that destroyed most of the city. The call went out far and wide for masons, as Portland stone was the material chosen to rebuild London properly. When the Masons came, they brought with them their secret societies. At first meeting in taverns, they expanded to dedicated lodges as non-operative Masons joined their ranks. When most of the rebuilding was done and the workers left for their next job, many of the larger lodges remained, with artists, scientists, and nobles filling their ranks. Scientists in particular, like Isaac Newton, used these secret societies to conduct controversial experiments, searching for things like the philosopher's stone that could turn base metal into gold, and the famed elixir that could bring eternal life. They still weren't sure where the old world of magic ended and the emerging world of science began, but they didn't want their reputations to be destroyed as John Dee's had been. Newton's involvement in these controversial experiments remained a secret for hundreds of years. Over time, Freemasonry evolved and expanded to include 3 and only 3 core degrees that are still used today: Entered Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master Mason. Lodge meetings were an interactive ritual that included drama, props, and costumes that allowed neophytes to work their way up the ranks. The lodges created competing false histories, trying to stretch their origins back as far as they could, first to early England, then to the time of Christ, then the Flood, and then Adam, and finally before the earth itself had been created. The demand for new experiences and additional knowledge resulted in numerous appendant rites, like the merit badges in Scouting. Each of these borrowed segments and narratives from the core degrees, with many religious traditions having a specific appendant rite. Allegory, symbols, and history common to all lodges include the building and destruction of the Temple of Solomon, with each Masonic lodge standing as proxy for the ancient edifice. Jacob's Ladder was an important conduit whereby God, known to Masons as the Grand Architect of the universe, would send heavenly messengers to earth 4 times a year during the solstices and equinox. The Tree of Life was based on 3 core pillars and was a way to level up as members worked together on the prime goal of Masonry, that of making good men better. Some of the many appendant rites included ones like Royal Ark Masonry with the catchphrase, "Holiness to the Lord." Masons would learn they were like worker bees and about the importance of gathering knowledge. Masonic words like keystone, cornerstone, and arch were sprinkled heavily into the rites, as were the Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood and the use of veils, handshakes, and secret knocks. Those given the Aaronic priesthood learned about the rod of Aaron, and the terms power of the rod, rodsman, and the power of Aaron were used synonymously. In one appendant rite, called the Elect of the Nine, Masons would role-play being one of Solomon's guards searching for an assassin. They would find him in a cave, drunk and asleep, laying next to his own sword, which they would use to behead him. At this point, you may be wondering, what does all this have to do with Mormonism? I promise you, we're almost done, and when we are, you'll see how it all fits together. Remember, I found each and every one of these stories by following clues in Lucy's book. We're now just a few years before Lucy Mack and Joseph Smith Sr. are married, and we find ourselves in Scotland. Young Robert Burns is being forced to leave for Jamaica, where he faces a sad life as a slave wrangler. On the last night presiding over his Masonic lodge, he shares a poem he wrote bidding farewell to his brethren at the St. James Lodge in Tarleton. Every Mason is thrilled to discover that they can buy an entire book of his poetry that includes other secret Masonic poems. This book can be kept out for everyone to enjoy, with only Masons knowing the hidden references. Robert sells out of the first printing, earns enough money to marry, and not only avoids the humilities waiting in Jamaica, he becomes Scotland's greatest poet. Freemasonry has now been around for several hundred years, and most no longer believe in the literal truth claims made early on. They've discovered the real alchemy of making good men better, and Burns is a shining example of this. The rise of Freemasonry has also guaranteed the widespread adoption of the King James Bible. You have the Freemasons of Scotland to thank every New Year's when you sing Bird's Auld Lang Syne. As for Robert, his farewell poem is recited in lodges all over the world, and eventually morphs into the much-shortened Masonic parting, Brethren, Adieu. Across the pond lives a very special Indian. Born in a Mohegan mud hut, Samson Occam eventually converts to Scottish Presbyterianism and enters the tiny school of the great minister, Eleazar Wheelock. Eleazar has made it his life's work to create missionaries and ministers to the Indians, and thrills at the chance to teach Indians to do this themselves. Like all of Eleazar's students, Samson is given a classical education and learns Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. He learns rhetoric and scriptures and how to act like a gentleman. Inspired by Eleazar's plan to educate more Indians, the now Reverend Samson Occam answers the call to serve a 2-year fundraising mission to England. He preaches over 300 sermons there to everyone, including royalty. He is asked to stay in England but declines, feeling himself to be more at home in Scotland. He crosses Hadrian's Wall, the physical barrier between the land in the north and the south, and is dismayed at the state of the Scottish Church, where even the sermon he'd first heard from Eleazar about the sword of justice appears to fall on deaf ears. He returns with honor, having raised millions in today's money. A special fund has been set up by the Scottish Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. They're keenly interested in methods for Christianizing heathens, as they still have murderous Druidic Highlanders causing them problems. Samson and Eleazar have a falling out when a remote site in New Hampshire is selected for the college. A few Indians near there are traditional enemies of Samson's tribe. Samson goes on to give and publish a famous execution sermon and creates his own tribe of Christian Indians in Oneida, a town about 30 miles west of Utica, New York. He never reconciles with Eleazar and dies peacefully among his people, the Brotherton Indians. Sam never sets foot on the campus he funded. His writings become the country's first Indian-authored bestseller. His sermons often include his belief that the Lord chose him, a weak thing of the world, and an Indian to bring about much righteousness. Buildings, ponds, and paths are named after him, and everyone on the campus he funded learns of his legend. Many, including famous people, thought his name was Samuel, the Indian. Eleazar names his remote college after his main benefactor, the Earl of Dartmouth. Another contributor has the charity prep school named after him. Both schools exist in the same location. They share the exact same buildings, teachers, and purpose: to turn young men into ministers and missionaries to the Indians, and to prepare them to become Freemasons. When Eleazar dies, his son John becomes the president of the college. The limited faculty includes the beloved Bezaleel Woodward, the math and philosophy professor, and the very popular and former student Professor John Smith. Professor Johnny is adored by the students and takes on several crucial jobs, including Professor of Learned Languages, the college librarian, the minister of the college church, and the owner of the local bookstore. Professor Johnny is the cousin of both Lucy Mack Smith's mother Lydia and Joseph Smith Sr.'s father, Assail. He is also the teacher who inspired former students, including Solomon Spaulding, Ethan Smith, and Daniel Webster. He is an expert lexicographer and master of ancient languages who not only reads, writes, and speaks Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and other languages, he's a published author who has written the grammars for many of them. He is also a natural philosopher and loves to debate and reason with his students. If you were lucky enough to be a student of early Dartmouth during the decades that Professor Johnny's teachings were the core curriculum, you would attend his Church of Christ and learn about the pre-existence, about a pre-earth atonement covenant where the plan of salvation was revealed to the Father, Sons, and the sons of men, and that Christ's church exists in all ages of the earth. You would attend his School of the Prophets, where you would learn Hebrew, Greek, Latin. You would learn that spirit is a simpler form of matter and about the importance of free agency and the prosperity cycle. You would learn that there are people living on other worlds, and that light, borrowed light, and the light of reason are the things that guide us. You might attend his Masonic Arminian sermons, where you would learn that priesthood is the source of Christ's authority. You would learn about the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood and how they are co-eternal with God. You would learn about degrees of glory in the eternities and about a spiritual death after the fall. You would learn that the Father argues for justice and the Son argues for mercy. As a new student, you would be encouraged to follow in the footsteps of Daniel Webster and join one of the 2 debating societies. Your dues would help fund the massive libraries used to prepare your team for the great end-of-year debates between the socials and the freighters. You would be taught correct principles and be expected to govern yourself wisely and to learn wisdom in your youth. The 2 debating society libraries placed Dartmouth in a position that far exceeded other premier religious schools of the day. The campus housed multiple poorly guarded collections of rare and valuable books on religion, philosophy, ancient languages, masonry, and more. Over 10,000 catalog titles were readily available, plus each professor had a personal library, and the small town had a well-stocked bookstore. In 1797, President Wheelock allowed Dr. Nathan Smith to join the faculty through a profit-sharing arrangement that turned Dartmouth into the 4th medical school in the United States. Dr. Nathan joined Professor Johnny and the rest of the small faculty and is remembered today mostly for his great deeds. But he was also infamous at the time for other deeds that were buried and require a little digging. Dr. Nathan Smith was living the early American dream. He had gone from poor farmer to doctor to educator, graduating from the 3rd medical school in the U.S. at Harvard and creating the 4th at Dartmouth. He went on to create other medical schools, but he kept being run out of town by angry mobs. His medical schools had a dark secret. Nathan's dilemma was that the growing country demanded good doctors. Good doctors must know anatomy, and learning anatomy required dissecting bodies. Bodies came from graves, but the public also demanded the sanctity of graves. More schools, however, meant greater demand for doctors, dissections, and bodies. There were several bad places for Nathan to get bodies. He left behind letters to other doctors asking them to procure bodies for him. There was also the time he hired the famous anatomist, Dr. Alexander Ramsay, the hunchback Scottish dwarf, but that lasted less than a year. There were students that he involved. One, Amos Twitchell, did a great job, but in 1809 another student did a lousy job and left behind his wallet at the scene of the crime. This led authorities straight back to Dartmouth, and the result was an angry mob demanding that the school be shut down. There were several good places to get bodies. The few criminals executed each year were fair game, and Nathan even wrote the governor asking him to delay an execution for months until his anatomy class was in session. With no federal law enforcement, a body procured across the river in Vermont was safe if it could be brought on campus. Likewise, bodies from New Hampshire were traded to the medical school in neighboring Vermont. The most effective means, however, was the professionals, known as the resurrectionists. These small teams had perfected their techniques, could train new recruits, and were a reliable source. As demand and risks increased with the growth of medical colleges, so did the rates, but public outcry could be kept to a minimum if you used professionals. In the highly religious era of his time, Nathan Smith learned a truth, like digging up a loved one's corpse for anatomy students to dissect, could negatively impact the faith and happiness of others, but it was still something that needed to be done. So it should be. It's just not something that you should talk about openly. Here is a fictional Help Wanted ad that shows exactly the type of professional that Nathan was looking for. Do you need money? Are you willing to bend the rules? Can you keep a secret? We need a spotter to quietly ride around locating fresh graves. We need able-bodied, quiet diggers at night. You need to have a good cover story like failed money digger, etc. We can pay you cash or kids' tuition and housing. A Mason or an Arminian preferred. No Puritans. Hiram Smith was born of goodly parents who recognized his intelligence. For the first 16 years of his life, he enjoyed the original Masonic spelling of his name, Hiram. When his family was given the opportunity to send only one of their children to an exclusive boarding school, Hiram was chosen over all his brothers, including his older brother, Alvin. In 1811, 11-year-old Hiram Smith goes off to the same boarding school that his cousin Stephen had started a year earlier. They live on campus at Dartmouth. There, Hiram studies to become a missionary to the Indians and a minister. He learns Greek, Latin, and Hebrew at a school of the prophets. He is indoctrinated with his relative John Smith's religious philosophies, attending thousands of sermons and prayers and lectures. He prepares to become a Mason and to receive the Masonic priesthood. He can attend the medical lectures of Dr. Nathan Smith, and he can watch debates among the socials and the freighters as they reason together. He has access to numerous religious libraries. At school, Hiram lives by a river in a great and spacious building. The manner of dress for his young, rich classmates and old teachers is exceedingly fine when compared with his plain clothes. His grandfather Solomon writes a religious book talking about a conversion experience where heavenly lights visited his room late at night. His uncle Jason is a charismatic cult leader. His family gets health care from Nathan Smith. His father, brother, and cousins are well diggers in a remote, isolated town that doesn't need wells. His family and Stephen's family move in together in a house owned by a Dartmouth trustee. It is this time period that Lucy recalls in her book with the famous story of Joseph's boyhood surgery. She remembers precise details and measurements about the surgery decades later, but somehow forgets that Dr. Nathan's last name is her own, Smith, and she refers to him instead as Dr. Stone. She claims that Joseph refuses to be bound or to take alcohol, but a loving parent would have required those things at that time. She claims that she sends Joseph to Uncle Jesse in Salem to recover in 1813, but she's been feuding with Jesse since 1799, and Salem at that time, why, it's still the battlefront for the War of 1812. She mentions that Hiram goes to an academy. Everything about her story implicates Dartmouth, but she won't mention it or the infamous grave-digging Dr. Nathan by name. In Hiram's 14th year, there's great interest in the subject of religion on campus. The Dartmouth Church of Masonic Arminians is in a battle with the town of Hanover's anti-Mason Calvinist Congregationalists, which is true. There's an unprecedented outpouring of spirit among all the students. A young Levi Spalding, a relative of Solomon, feels unworthy. He retires to a secret grove to pray. Levi wonders which church to join, and he's visited by a flash of brilliant light and feels that his sins are forgiven. Levi shares this experience widely right away and only ever tells one version. He leaves for a lifelong mission to the Indians, but not the Native Americans, the actual Indians in India. Many students are inspired by young Levi, and they join the spiritual revival that spreads throughout the campus. By 1816, it's clear that Dr. Nathan Smith must go. He's perjured himself at a grave robbing trial. His attempts to calm the town have actually converted more to strict Calvinism. These Calvinist trustees become the majority and take over the Dartmouth leadership. The Arminian theology and John Smith's teachings are buried. The ban on recruiting Masons on campus is enforced, and Nathan's own daughter dies at 15 years of age. He flees town after his last lectures. The students revolt at attempts to seize their unguarded massive libraries, and on the other side of the world, there's a catastrophe as Mount Tambora blows up. Old Dartmouth is dead. At the same time, the Smith family is warned out of Norwich. They're kicked out of the Dartmouth trustee's house along with the Mack family. Hiram is yanked from school 1 year before he graduates, and Stephen, who has just graduated, goes with them. For 20 years, they've only moved back and forth 5 to 20 miles in a tight little circle and always near family. Yet this time, Joseph Sr. leaves with massive debts and goes 300 miles away. The older boys follow, and then Lucy. She cheats the driver at Oneida, just west of Utica, and in her manuscript just forgets to mention that this is the name of the famous town of Occam's Brotherhood Indians. The family reunites in Palmyra, with only a small portion of their effects and, according to Lucy, 2 cents to their name. Shortly after arriving in a new town with no connections, Joseph Sr. borrows money for horses. Hiram gets a new alias, Hyrun. His name is changed from Masonic to Biblical years before the Morgan affair. Lucy acquires a cake and beer shop on Main Street and has young Joseph peddle her wares, mainly at revivals. The family is able to buy land, build homes, and thrive, while many in the rest of the world starve and die. After 11 months, Joseph Sr. sues instead of paying for the horses and requests a Masonic jury. His prior Masonic blackball should preclude him from joining a lodge, yet Alvin, Joseph Sr., and Hiram all become Freemasons, at different lodges. They keep digging for money for the next 15 years, but they never ever find any. And many neighbors later testify that they simply don't know how the Smith family earns money. Meanwhile, back east, many rare and expensive books have gone missing from Dartmouth. There's no Scotichronicon to be found anywhere on campus. It's strange that a college founded as a Scottish religious institution does not have the Scottish religious history book. Harvard has one, but that would be like a Book of Mormon being found at Notre Dame, but not at BYU. Nathan moves on to Yale to form his next medical school. He prefers to get his corpses from secret suppliers. More medical schools continue to pop up everywhere. The demand for dead bodies explodes. It's supplied from well-organized teams, yet no one, ever, claims credit. Following the pattern of the Old Testament Joseph, the Smith family first goes through 7 fat years in New York. The multi-talented clan enjoys the fruits of 3 Freemasons, 3 conjurers, 3 Presbyterians. 6 of them have a basic education. 2, the parents, have a good education, and 1, Hiram, has an excellent education far exceeding the others. Lucy has become a midwife, and at least 3 family members have become failed money diggers. During this time, the family not only survives, somehow they thrive. After that, the future doesn't look so bright. The Smith family's luck changes completely overnight, and tragedy strikes when Alvin dies, kicking off 7 lean years. The family advertises in the local newspaper that they've camped in the graveyard with Alvin's body for 5 weeks, just in case someone tries to rob it. Even though the younger boys are now as old as Alvin was when they first moved into town, any honest labor that is being done just isn't enough to pay the bills. Mounting debts soar. 2 possible Smith benefactors, Nathan Smith and Stephen Mack grow old and die. The family loses their large home. They need some new plan, or total financial ruin lies just ahead. A quick inventory of the resources of the most capable Smiths show they have a veritable dream team of talent. Joseph Sr. and Lucy, the directors, have a good solid education. He's a Freemason with connections, and she's a church-going Presbyterian popular among her congregation. He's a conjurer and failed money digger, but also has a talent as a writer, which will be shown later when he starts selling patriarchal blessings. Lucy is a capable midwife, and she also is an author, as shown by the 300-page book she'll create 15 years later. Hiram, the writer, has both the benefits of a lodge of Freemason brethren and the same church congregation his mom goes to. He also has been a failed money digger, but his authoring capabilities are beyond question, and his massive brain has been well trained by a first-rate education. His penmanship is also flawless. Magic Man Joseph, the actor, has a few tricks up his sleeve. He has minimal education, but is a well-practiced conjurer and has the ability to quickly memorize and recite large sections from books. It also doesn't hurt that he's charming and charismatic. The team seeks to recreate the magic of Robert Burns and comes up with a simple three-phase plan. First, the three writers will create a book. Second, Joseph will help give it a magic reveal. And third, the family can avoid total financial Armageddon. For their surefire bestseller, they decide to target the market they know, the 30,000 Freemasons right there in New York. They'll use Joseph to give it a genius illiterate farmer feel, with a very Masonic reveal involving an angel descending Jacob's ladder during the autumn equinox, revealing buried gold plates in a stone box. And Hiram will go one better than his fellow Dartmouth alumni. He'll make it Indian-themed, but his Indians won't just be Jews like Ethan Smith's in the view of the Hebrews. His book will reveal that ancient Native Americans were actually Freemasons. They'll also write it in the popular King James Bible style, then in vogue. The goal is to plagiarize but obfuscate the source material. A Latin history book like the Scotichronicon is a good choice. Latin stories use phrases like et factum to connect paragraphs. This translates into, and it came to pass, which certainly sounds biblical and takes up a lot of space, making the finished book thicker. The legend of Scotia and Gaithless can be used as a framework. Ireland and Scotland can be swapped out with the New World. The whole thing can be kicked off just before the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. Added bonus, Latin text is full of Semitic complexity, including chiasmus like that found in Greek and Hebrew writings. The Abbot of Bridger Bower and the original compiler Fordham can be used as characters. To make sure even the thickest Mason gets the Burnsian Masonic wings, have the first order of business for the colonists be to build a new Masonic lodge, a.k.a. Solomon's Temple. Have a single river in the land, and name it after the Phoenician shipbuilding port where Scotia is from. Make sure Prophet Jacob shows up early to give the Masonic parting, brethren, adieu. Don't forget a tree of life, some visions, do an elective 9-type story where a good guy cuts off a drunk bad guy's head with his own sword. You know, make it Masonic. For added filler, we can use the story of Samson Occam the Indian, but we'll rename him Samuel the Lamanite. We can take entire sections of the Masonic King James Bible and just put them in somewhere. When we want patriarchal-sounding advice, we'll use the teachings of Professor Johnny. For the destruction just before Christ's arrival, we can use the accounts of the devastation in Indonesia following the eruption of Mount Tambora. We'll take a Sales family blessing, and we'll expand that into King Benjamin's sermons, and we'll take the names of people, locations, and events and scramble them up a bit. Let's construct a timeline to connect the chapters together, and then we'll divvy up that work among the writing team. For the initial protagonist, the writing team didn't need inspiration, just a good memory to tell a story about a family that was forced to leave their home and travel far away, where one parent murmurs and wants to return to the parent's land, and a visionary other parent believes God has a plan for them, where children are sent back to steal provisions and rare books that include scriptures and genealogy, where the parents are surprised and happy to learn from those stolen books that they're all descended from Joseph of Egypt, that when they arrive in their new land they thrive for a bit, and the brothers, they often fight, but then they make up. If the first family in the Book of Mormon is really based upon the Smith family, who could be who? Well, in Lucy's later books, she repeatedly compares herself to Lehi and even offers a story where she is leading people to a new land on a boat. She vividly recalls Lehi-style dreams when she is 70 years old. This would make sense if the dreams were always hers. If Joseph Smith Jr. were Nephi, well, he wouldn't have a younger brother also named Joseph. But if Nephi were really Hiram, then that and a brother named Sam does make sense. Joseph Sr. could easily be the basis for Sariah, who murmurs and wants to return to the land of her inheritance. I'm sure the thought of returning to his father Assael's farms crossed Joseph Sr.'s mind more than once. These character assignments make sense for other reasons. Sariah is not a biblical name, but Saraiah was a high priest in the Temple of Solomon and shows up all over Masonic lore. Gender-bending the name helps obfuscate the source. Nephi is Latin for pleasant, and can also be Masonically decoded from the tribe Saraiah belonged to. Lehi is Latin for midway, but is also a location in the Bible where the ass talked, and means jawbone or storyteller, a most appropriate pseudonym for Lucy. Each name is also an exact character match for the counterpart, which, by itself, may seem merely coincidental, until you consider that every chapter in the Book of Mormon, except the one added later, follows this pattern, and produces a nice division of labor for the writing team. That, combined with the mashed-up sources, would account for the multiple author voices found using computerized word print analysis. One of Lucy's assigned books, Alma, is also Latin for nourishing, and is almost always combined as alma mater, which translates to nourishing mother, and is also a Latin reference to a previously attended school, like Dartmouth. If these three were the writing team, they did a nice job of giving themselves a shout-out in the opening line of the Book of Mormon. I, Nephi, think of Hiram, having been born of goodly parents. Well, that includes all three of them right there. Now, this type of obfuscation happens all the time in the tech industry, and this team did a fairly good job. But they didn't even have to be that clever if they had confidence that Joseph, their frontman, would perform his part well. Like any good startup, the team needed some seed capital to kick things off. The first possible investor was Martin Harris. Gullible and wealthy, and in a bad marriage to his cousin, he was looking for more from life, including spending time with his girlfriend. The Smiths had worked for him in the past, including Lucy, who had been the midwife for his wife. Joseph Sr. and Lucy were tasked with the approach, and the result was that Martin was on board. Joseph Jr. was assigned to land the second investor. Isaac Hale was his reluctant and very wealthy father-in-law. He was still angry that Joseph and Emma had eloped. Practical and pragmatic, he gave Joseph a small cabin, but made him work for everything he gave him. This was helpful to Joseph personally, but wasn't a help to the project or the rest of the Smith family. The result was that Joseph did not end up signing him, and in tears he admitted to his father-in-law that he had never been a real conjurer. Joseph's role for the magic reveal is crucial. He is the diversion. Like the disappearing coin trick, his job is to draw the attention away from the writers. His lack of a formal education and common manners, that makes it all seem more magical. This works so well that even now, when people lose faith in the story about angels and gold plates, they still think Joseph was a genius who wrote it all himself. Joseph's true genius would be revealed later, but at this stage he didn't even own a King James Bible. And if he'd had most of it already committed to memory, he wouldn't have needed to buy himself a copy when the Book of Mormon went to print. He had a good memory, maybe not photographic, but still way better than average. With Hiram's manuscript at the ready in Alvin's wooden box, the actual trick was pretty simple. Prior to a translation session, Joseph would load a few pages into memory. Then, in front of his scribe, he would place his rock and his head into his hat. The scribe would write whatever he recited, and there you have a magic reveal. Joseph had a few other tricks he could use to speed things up. He could spell out words he couldn't pronounce, and because of his memory he could pick up the translation at the exact point where he'd left off. He could ask Emma about details he wasn't sure about, like if Jerusalem had a wall around it to make sure Hiram wasn't tricking him. Eventually, he nailed up a curtain between himself and Martin Harris. This meant he could skip the whole memorizing step and didn't have to keep his head buried in a hat all day, and didn't have to look at Martin. If he'd been too busy to memorize his pages, or was tired of the work, he could pretend he was in a fight with Emma, go into the woods to pray, and there he could memorize or relax and return hours later to continue. Coinciding with the execution of the Book of Mormon version 1.0 plan, a Freemason named William Morgan announces his intention to publish an anti-Masonic book in New York that would reveal the appendant ceremonies. Morgan is kidnapped and murdered, and Masons are suspected. The alleged kidnappers come from the same lodge in Canandaigua that Joseph Smith Sr. belongs to. When the trial is over, the accused murderers have avoided harsh punishment. Anti-Masonic sentiment reaches a fever pitch by mid-1828. All churches and many leaders publicly come out against Masonry. Membership drops, Masons go into hiding. In New York, 400 lodges close with only about 80 remaining. Membership falls from the tens of thousands to less than 3,000. Thomas Paine's lost Masonic chapter of the Anti-Religious Age of Reason is ironically touted by Christians who are convinced of his claims that Masonry is just a shell set up to secretly hide Scottish Druid sun worship. This bombshell sends anti-Masonic sentiment through the roof. An overtly Masonic Book of Mormon is doomed, as there is no longer a market for anything pro-Masonry. A partial rewrite is needed. The Book of Mormon version 2.0 plan is to drop the overtly Masonic tone and instead appear to focus more on the spiritual than the historical. As part of this, plans are also made to restore their relative John Smith's Church of Christ from Dartmouth. The team modifies the magic reveal to make the work move faster, keeps the hidden Masonic shoutouts in an effort to bring closet Masons on board, who would be thrilled to find they had done Paine one better and were now hiding Masonry inside a shell of Christianity. The initial 116 pages are stolen back by the family due to the need for the rewrite. Joseph is sent home to care for his wife Emma. As the Smith family debt continues to climb and Hiram takes on debt, cousin Oliver Cowdery, a Freemason, is enlisted to speed things up. He lives with the Hiram, Joseph Sr., and Lucy family during the winter as they clean up the manuscript. Cowdery is assigned the Book of Helaman and stuffs it full of seemingly anti-Masonic ideas. Joseph and Oliver meet for the first time in April 1829, and the entire work is ready for the printers by June. Working with Oliver, Joseph Jr. has very little work to do, as a magic reveal is rarely needed. The rock and the hat trick is still deployed on occasion, and is used to convince the Whitmers of the book's divine origin. To convince witnesses of the divine origin, costumes and props from the now empty Masonic lodges are deployed. The witnesses who rely on their actual physical eyes merely testify that they have seen someone who looks like an angel holding something that looks like golden plates, with markings on them that they cannot read. This is hardly evidence that what is printed in the Book of Mormon came from that angel or those plates. It makes things easier if every witness is related to a Whitmer or a Smith. It's also worth noting that every witness still alive in 1845, except William Smith and Oliver Cowdery, fall for a similar, yet better executed trick played by Strang. With Lucy and Joseph Sr. standing in as the paternal voice of God in the early revelations, a new church is organized, patterned after the old church at Dartmouth. Many of the early members come from Freemasonry and instantly recognize the Masonic message barely concealed in the Book of Mormon. They do not get caught up in the obvious and glaring errors or inaccuracies in the text because they know, as former Freemasons, that truths can be hiding inside stories and fables that are not literally true. Masonry hiding inside Mormonism has also lowered the rung of Jacob's ladder. The new goal is to not just make good men better. Using the new Mormon priesthood, there is the added goal of making bad men good. Unfortunately, not enough copies of the Book of Mormon were sold to save the Smith farm. Joseph Sr. went to debtor's prison while Hiram hid. A school of the prophets was set up when the saints migrated to Ohio, and Joseph Jr. and his brothers were finally given the educational opportunities similar to those Hiram had enjoyed at Dartmouth. They did not use Professor Johnny's textbooks. The Smith family had lots of adventures, including the time Hiram and Joseph were in Liberty Jail, and Hiram wrote amazing letters that Joseph copied as revelations 4 days later. As more and more believing Christians joined the church, Christian-style histories and visions were added, first by Orson Pratt and then others, to create a more faith-promoting narrative for the true believers. Several versions were needed to get it just right. Soon after reaching Ohio, Hiram oversaw the construction of a Masonic lodge. It was laid out properly on an east-west line. It was called a temple, like unto Solomon's. As more members joined the church, the Smith family started earning regular, steady incomes. They gathered wealth, speculated on real estate, operated financial institutions, hotels, and steamships. Only the first 5 leaders of the Mormon Church were Freemasons. When Joseph finally booted up, he discovered the Book of Mormon theology didn't match his, so he revised it. When the saints arrived in Ohio, several medical schools opened, including one 4 miles from the temple. When the saints left, every school closed due to grave-robbing scandals. After the saints reached Nauvoo, Masonry was on the rise again. An excited Joseph pushed the men to make sure everyone became a Freemason. He himself went through the 3 degrees and achieved Master Mason status in 2 days, by memorizing texts that takes most men months. The Nauvoo endowment wasn't stolen from Freemasonry. It was designed as an independent right, initially an add-on. Freemasons were in the mob that murdered Joseph and Hiram, upset with polygamy and the way Mormons practiced Masonry. Brigham Young successfully navigated the secession crisis, traded resources to Lucy and Emma so Lucy would not publish her book, and left for Utah thinking the matter settled. As an early saint and Freemason, Brigham himself was one of those who had converted to Mormonism years before the first vision story, when it was all Masonic illusions. Brigham Young was a figurative Mormon. Have you ever wondered why any believing member could claim absolute knowledge that every other truth claim of the Church is literally true, except for the many times over its entire history where the Church has repeated the pattern of openly admitting that it lied? Well, that's because that many feel that a truth that could negatively impact the faith of others is something that should not be talked about openly. But as a figurative Mormon, I believe any real truth should be openly talked about, and that you should not leave a marriage, break up a family, or ostracize a loved one just because they no longer believe the literal truth claims of an organization that has repeatedly admitted it lies. This is not even part of the theology. Those who doggedly insist that truth is only found in stories that must literally be true, well, they should remember that other ancient storyteller who was clear his stories were not literally true, but he didn't call his stories fables. He called them parables. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and be sure to get your copy of the Lucy Code. If you have any feedback, good or bad, be sure to send it at dptrebus@gmail.com and include the Lucy Code in the header. I'll try to get back to you. Thanks.